Welcome to this lecture on Sustainable Optometry. Hello, my name is Simon Berry. I'm an optometrist from Durham. I opened my own independent practice 20 years ago. And I've always been keen on some of the ethical issues about running a practice. I think it's one thing for me to go out and buy a cheap shirt somewhere, but if I stock a product or a range of frames, then I'm endorsing that product, and I don't really want to endorse something that's been made in an unethical manner. So I've always been quite keen to try and find out the provenance of the products that I stock and whether they've been produced in a sustainable way. Around 6 years ago, I kind of formalised this and developed what I called an ethical supply questionnaire. I now give this to my suppliers to try and rate how ethical their product is. 6 years ago, that was really difficult and nobody really seemed to care about these issues. But now in some ways I think we're facing the opposite problem. Ethical products now have a market and a price, and this means from some companies we're faced with a bit of greenwashing, where a product is made to look a little bit more environmentally friendly than it really is. Sustainability is a huge and complex area, and we've got 50 minutes. It's a daunting subject. In some ways, I feel a little bit like when I go and see my accountant. I'm an optometrist and a clinician. I'm rubbish at all the financial stuff, and yet I've got to have a basic understanding to try and run a business. Ethical stuff is kind of the same. We can never hope to digest all the information and truly understand all the complexities because we've all got our own full-time jobs. The best that we can do is be aware of some of the issues and being aware of some of the things that we can influence and change, and that's what I hope to do for you in this lecture. And the last thing to point out before we start is that sustainability is a universal topic. Everyone has an opinion on it and chooses to believe the sources they trust. But it's never as simple as believing the opinions of Donald Trump or Greta Thunberg. There are bucket loads of information out there, and we're only exposed to the information that we come across. Now, I'm sure at some point in this lecture you'll disagree with something I have to say, or I'll get something wrong or miss something out. But give me a little bit of leeway. You can email me later. This lecture is based on what I've been told and done for the last 20 years of running my practice, and around about 30 or so different sources that I've looked at in preparing the lecture. So to begin, let's define a few terms. I've deliberately used a lot of different terms in my introduction: sustainable, fair trade or ethical, but these terms are not all the same and it's worth quickly defining them. So environmentally friendly or eco-friendly is a nice easy one to start with. It just means something that is not harmful to the environment. Fair trade, again, fairly easy to define. It's applied when we're talking about producers in developing countries and companies in developed countries. Fair trade is guaranteeing that marginalised groups of producers are paid a fair price for their produce. Many fair trade organisations use the definition by an association called FINE, which is like the SightCare for fair trade companies, and it's the FINE definition that I've quoted on this slide. So fair trade is a trading partnership based on dialogue, transparency and respect that seeks greater equity in international trade. Ethical trade is a little bit more open to interpretation. The term started to be used in the mid-1990s, and it can be used as an umbrella term for all types of business practices that promote more environmentally friendly and responsible trade. But it's generally applied to workers' rights. So organisations such as Ethical Trading Initiative ask retail companies to sign up to a code of labour practice to improve the working conditions for the people in their supply chain. So it's things like making sure there's no forced labour or child labour and that working conditions are safe and hygienic. Ethical trade is a more general term than fair trade, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the producers are from developing countries. And then sustainability. Now this is the difficult one. There are an estimated 300 definitions of sustainability in the published literature. The most often quoted comes from the United Nations, from their World Commission on Environment and Development, and it's their definition that I've quoted on this slide. So sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainability is all about using resources sensibly and fairly. So for the purposes of this lecture, and to coin a phrase, I'd like you to think of sustainable optometry as encompassing all of these terms. Thank you to those people that filled in my sustainability survey. It was designed to explore attitudes to sustainable optometry, and all the answers from that questionnaire, from that survey, are going to be revealed in this lecture. If you didn't know about the survey, I can email a copy if you'd like, but now I need to admit something. I played a little trick on you all. I didn't just give that survey out to optometrists, I gave the same survey to patients from my practice. I just phrased the question slightly differently. I thought it would be interesting to see whether optometry staff and the general public had the same attitude to certain things. Nothing particular scientific about it. I gave the survey out to every patient that was buying glasses or looking at glasses in my practice over the last month or so. So question 4 on that survey asked, who do you believe has the greater responsibility in ensuring a sustainable optometry industry? There were 3 options to pick, either the manufacturer, the optometry practice, or the patient. For optometry staff, the top answer was the manufacturer. I'll tell you what patients thought at the end of this lecture. The first question was a nice general question, and it asked, in your day-to-day life, would you actively buy sustainable products? 96% of patients and 85% of optometry staff said yes to that question. So this subject is something that the majority of us are aware of and try and do our bit. So really it should be something that we should look to address in our business lives too. So, sustainable optometry, can we really save the world? Well, I guess, what is it that needs saving? What are the environmental problems that the world is facing at the moment? There's no real definitive list of these, but if you search around the internet and look at different lists that different organisations have put together, there are 11 things that are generally included in everyone's list. We've got global warming, loss of biodiversity, pollution, acidification of the oceans, deforestation, overfishing, ozone layer depletion, creation of unsustainable waste such as plastics, changes in the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles, waste disposal because humans produce a lot of waste and there's limited space for it, and overpopulation. And I guess one thing to point out from this list is that the problems that the world faces are not necessarily the ones that hit the headlines. 20 years ago, we were all talking about those holes in the ozone layer, and that problem has not gone away, but it's now the unsustainable plastic that tends to hit the headlines. In terms of optometry saving the world, if you think about the energy and the materials that we use in our practices, then out of those 11, we could arguably have some sort of small influence over these 5. Now that list is fairly depressing, so let's try and be a bit more positive and turn the question around. Rather than dwell on the nasty things that are going wrong with our planet, let's look at the people that know about this stuff, those that are trying to change things and what their priorities look like. How can we make a difference? And again, there's lots and lots of information and targets from different organisations, but I think one that encompasses most of the issues and what people are trying to achieve is the United Nations target. In 2015, the UN adopted their Sustainable Development Goals with their ambitious and generous aim that by 2030 they want all people across the globe to enjoy peace and prosperity. They have 17 headline goals with 169 different targets to achieve these goals. So far they have published over 1,300 papers on the topic. So these goals are no poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, renewable energy, good jobs and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, climate action, protect life below the water, protect life on land, peace and justice, and promote partnerships to achieve all of these goals. All very grand and worthy. It's a bit more difficult to see how optometry fits into these goals, but arguably these 6 are the ones that we could potentially have some influence on and could help with these goals. So back to our little practices and what day-to-day impact can we really hope to achieve. And I think in terms of running a sustainable practice, you can kind of split things into 2 big talking points. One is the way that we run our businesses, and the other is the products that we choose to stock. Our day-to-day business is often overlooked, but I think it's probably one of the most important things to consider because that's what we've got most direct control over. Being sustainable is a certain mindset, and it doesn't just mean that we buy a few recycled spectacle frames. So things like energy use. Are we looking at ways of reducing our energy? Are we looking at companies that guarantee to supply renewable energy? Staff issues. Do we pay a fair wage to our staff and support them when things go wrong? Community is very important. We are a service industry and we exist because the community around us support us. Are we just taking what they give us? Or are we supporting the people that support us and give back to our community? Do we use local suppliers where possible? Consumables. Are we looking at ways of reducing those consumables, going paperless or using recycled paper? Email or text reminders to reduce postage? Waste disposal is a lecture all in itself. It gets so complicated. But how we dispose of our waste is an important part of being sustainable. As far as an ethical waste stream goes, we can think about maximising any resource recovery, for example, recycling as much as possible, and minimising the environmental impact from the eventual end stage. In our practices, we have a responsibility to segregate our waste into hazardous and non-hazardous waste. Clinical waste and hazardous waste is incinerated at a temperature over 850 degrees Celsius. It takes a lot of energy. But there are some companies that use energy recovery techniques or try to recycle some of the metals that they find after incineration. Landfill is always seen as the worst option environmentally, and different waste companies have a different ethos in how they ensure that the least amount of waste goes to landfill. So we pick the companies that deal with our waste, so we could do a little bit more digging to make sure that they are doing all that they can. And the second large area to talk about are the products that we choose to stock, and that's what we're going to concentrate on for the remainder of this lecture. So what makes a sustainable product? Well, I guess it's worth pointing out that no product is completely sustainable. Everything that is produced anywhere has some environmental impact. Even local organic tomatoes take nutrients from the soil, or a cool local beer needs grain, water and energy to chill it in a fridge. It's impossible to be completely sustainable, so the only thing that we can comment on is whether the benefit of the product to us is worth it for what it costs the environment. And for that, we need something called a life cycle assessment. This is the only method that evaluates the impact of the product over its entire lifespan, from the extraction of the raw material, the creation of the product, the transportation and distribution, how the product is used, how it's eventually disposed of. All of this is encompassed by a life cycle assessment. But us as optometrists, there is no way we're going to get all of this information. We don't manufacture our products, so we have to trust our suppliers with the information that they give us. And in many cases, even our suppliers don't have the answers because they are distributors and they're too far removed from the manufacturer. And then to make things even more complicated, sustainability is now a commodity. It's what many consumers want, and that means that it can be exploited. So a supplier might not tell us the whole story. They'll gloss over the issues that they don't want us to know about and shout about the ones that they do. And this is known about and widespread in other industries. There's a man called Kevin Brady, who's a university lecturer and has written lots of books on the environment. And as part of his course, he asks students to investigate products that claim to be ethical and sustainable, and he finds that their claims are only correct about 20% of the time. So can we really trust the people in our industry that are telling us how sustainable their product is, because there is no independent organisation that's checking any of these claims? And they all tell us about different things. Some will talk about the materials they use, or maybe the logistics and packaging choices. Some might talk about sustainable development, maybe through charitable causes and community-based projects. And yet others will focus on their carbon footprint, or their recycled content, or their water consumption, or their energy efficiency. It's a minefield of claims that we as optometrists have no chance at all of knowing whether a claim is genuine. So in some ways we have to decide which are the issues that we care about and which are the issues our patients care about, and that can be quite a personal decision. One of the questions in my survey asked people what they thought was the most important of these issues when buying sustainable glasses. I gave them 8 choices, either that there were no environmental concerns, or carbon neutral, plastic free, recyclable, fair trade, the materials used, the country of manufacture, or the waste produced in that manufacture. I'll tell you those results in a minute, but since we tend to hear about some issues in more than others, I thought we could look at some of the headline issues in a little bit more detail. So, plastic. Is all plastic evil? Of course, the plastic waste in our oceans is disgraceful and it needs addressing. And that's not the only environmental cost of plastic. It's estimated that 6% of global oil production goes into making new plastics, pumping 390 million tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year. That's about 15% of the global carbon budget. And it's harmful to get rid of. A lot of it still goes into landfill, where chemicals can leach out into the soil. If it's incinerated, it creates harmful dioxins that can pollute the air, and the marine pollution is well publicised. So it's right that so much effort is put into reducing new plastic production as a whole. But is that relevant to our industry? Most of the plastic that we use in our day-to-day optometry life are higher grade plastics, such as CR39. These serve a useful purpose, and if you looked at its life cycle, then the amount of new plastic created is arguably justified for the length of time that it serves that purpose. We don't really use anything that's the equivalent of a plastic straw or a drinks bottle. So how much plastic do you think we are adding to our patients' total consumption? So let's take an average patient with an average plastic spectacle frame as an example. We'll overestimate the weight and say there's 25 grams of plastic in a frame, and then we'll double that to allow for any waste involved in the manufacture. So very roughly 50 grams of plastic used to make a spectacle frame that will last that patient on average 2 years. And then we'll add a lot of extra plastic for each patient, a couple of minims, a Goldman tip, lenses, frame case, all those guarantee cards that lens companies give us. We could probably easily get to about 150, 160 grams if we include all the packaging and all the bits and pieces. The average person in the UK throws away about 85 grams of plastic packaging every single day. That is 62 kilograms over the same 2-year lifespan as the average patient, which really puts it into perspective how much plastic our industry is adding to our patients' consumption total. You almost can't see it on this slide. It's less than 0.1% of the average person's plastic packaging waste. Because these figures are only when you look at packaging. If you look at plastic consumption as a whole, which a study in Science did that was published in 2015, if you average out all the waste from business, industry and agriculture in the UK, it amounts to 215 grams of plastic consumption per person per day in the UK. There's lots of arguments over the figures for plastic consumption, but everybody agrees on the general pattern. Everyone agrees that packaging is the biggest problem, and this pie chart shows the split between different sources of plastic waste in the UK. As you can see, it's estimated that just under 70% of plastic waste comes from packaging. So it's great that we're all becoming a little bit more aware that creating new plastic needs to be avoided, but maybe we should be a little bit cleverer in our industry about where we direct our efforts. We should definitely be looking at packaging and not just the product we're using. And it's great that we're starting to stock more sustainable frame materials, but these are generally aimed at the higher market. These are the frames that are going to last 2 years. So if you looked at our example, we're going to save 50 grams of new plastic production in that 2-year span. Unfortunately, the least sustainable plastics are the ones used in cheaper frames. So if you took the example of a child who breaks their glasses every 6 weeks, then their consumption for the same product over that 2-year lifespan would be 850 grams, 17 times as much. So if we concentrated our efforts trying to introduce sustainable materials into different areas of our business, packaging and cheaper frames, then potentially we could save much more new plastic being created. There is at least one other area of plastic consumption worth mentioning, and that is in the single-use plastic demo lenses. And yes, there's lots of people out there looking how to make demo lenses a bit more eco-friendly, but why don't we just stop using them? The only purpose they serve is to show patients what a frame would look like with lenses in, but we can do that in other ways with using dispensing technology. And really in the COVID climate, they steam up anyway when patients are wearing masks. So rather than trying to find a solution to the problem, let's just get rid of the problem. But I know that half of you in here disagree with me. In my survey, I asked the question whether people thought the demo lenses were relevant in a modern optometry practice. 50% of optometry staff said that patients expected to see a true representation of their glasses and that demo lenses were necessary in our industry. How many patients do you think agreed with you? Only 12% of patients, meaning that 88% of patients would rather that demo lenses weren't used. So maybe this isn't a true representation, but it does hint that there are certain things that we believe are important to our customers might be not important as we think. So on to the next big topic, recycling, which is kind of linked to plastics as well. The new 3 R's are beginning to be taught in our school: reduce, reuse, recycle. With limited resources, we should make the best use of that resource, whether it's a raw material or a created man-made plastic. It only takes 12% of the energy to recycle a plastic than to create it from scratch. So if a product can be recycled, it's generally deemed as wholesome and good, but as with everything, it's a complex area. For example, we can't easily recycle bioplastics, which are big in our industry. We all use cellulose acetate, but it will never likely to be part of a widespread recycling scheme, although as you all know, there are specialist companies that are doing it. That being said, pure cellulose acetate is a relatively environmentally friendly plastic. It's biodegradable and it can be composted, but only if you can guarantee that it is pure and plant-based. And that's one of the huge problems in our industry. We don't really know what the majority of our frames are made from. If you think of clothes, every item of clothing has a label that tells you what the main component of that product is. A spectacle frame is held close to your skin or the patient's skin every minute of every day, and yet there is very little information available to the consumer about what the frame is made from or what dyes or chemicals are used in its manufacture. And recycling becomes a problem when you get contaminated waste streams because you don't really know what's in that recycling bin. In the UK, it's estimated that we recycle roughly 30% of our plastic waste, depending on which statistic you believe. Of the remaining 70%, most of it ends up in landfill, with around 20% of that being incinerated for energy recovery. Of the 30% that we do recycle, most of it ends up being exported. We export roughly 2/3 of our plastic waste. Most of it used to be to China until they insisted that they would only receive waste that was 99.5% pure plastic with no contamination, and we couldn't guarantee that. So now we send most of our plastic to Malaysia or Turkey. We still don't process much plastic here in the UK, although we do process most of our paper, cardboard, metal and glass recycling. For us as optometry practices, recycling can be expensive. If we choose to recycle our frames or contact lenses, then companies like TerraCycle, who specialise in those hard to recycle items, charge quite a lot to supply their boxes. It's an added business expense on top of all our other waste contracts and business rates. One other option that we have is to use frame companies that will recycle their own plastics. They manufacture it, so they already know what it's made from and can more effectively recycle it. And there are companies starting to do this, a few examples being Coral Eyewear, Botanique or Monkey Glasses. And probably more significantly, Mazzucchelli, that global leader in cellulose acetate production, last year introduced its first sustainable acetate sheet that was partially made from recycled acetate. This is a much more mainstream use of a recycled material, and there are now larger frame companies starting to use this. So things are changing in our industry. And I guess in terms of reuse, it's worth quickly mentioning the charity projects that take on old glasses. There are a few companies still donating glasses to the developing world, but as you probably know, a few years ago the World Health Organization decided that sending old glasses overseas was not the best use of a resource. So a lot of charities that once collected glasses are starting to change their focus and look to recycle the glasses rather than trying to reuse them. Recycling is good. It's one of the answers, but it's not the only answer. and carbon footprint. One of the ways that we can try and quantify our impact on the planet is by knowing our carbon footprint. It's a concept we're all familiar with. It was invented in the 1990s and became popular after BP funded a huge advertising campaign to bring it to the public's attention. Their aim being to try and shift some of the blame to the consumer rather than the oil industry. That being said, it's a useful benchmark to see how our lifestyles can affect greenhouse gas emissions. The more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the more heat is stored, and it all contributes to global temperature rises and weather changes. But your carbon footprint is not just reliant on carbon emissions, it's an estimate of all of your greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, carbon dioxide, but also methane, nitrogen oxides and fluorinated gases. For simplicity though, the results are always given as a grams of carbon dioxide equivalent. Once you know your total, you can choose to offset it by supporting projects that aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or their concentrations in the atmosphere. My practice is carbon neutral, which sounds great, doesn't it? I've never advertised this fact because I don't really think it means that much. When I paid a company to work out my carbon footprint, they looked at my business travel and my energy bills and nothing else. They didn't look at my mix of stock, they didn't look at how efficient my heating systems were or where my staff were travelling from. My electricity didn't count against me because I use Ecotricity and they guarantee that the electricity comes from renewable sources. So it only cost me £90 to offset the entire carbon that I was producing that year in the practice. Undoubtedly, the biggest carbon usage that I contribute to is the mix of stock that I choose to source and buy. Spectacle frames are manufactured in a variety of different factories around the world: China, Brazil, Italy, South Korea, and in a variety of different manufacturing processes. One of the strange quirks in our industry is that if a frame is marked as made in a particular country, it's only the most expensive part of that production that has to be done in the country. The parts can come from anywhere, and this is one of the reasons it's so difficult to work out the true carbon footprint of an individual frame. Even frames from the same range and the same company come from a combination of different raw materials that come from different sources. So it's impossible to work out the carbon footprint of a frame, and as far as I'm aware, nobody has tried to do so in our industry. And that's why I've tried to do it. Last year I started a project with Durham University to try and answer this question. And we've attempted to come up with an algorithm that would allow optometrists to pick a frame from stock and roughly work out what the carbon footprint is. My hope is that if we get this algorithm right, then we'll be able to work out a true carbon footprint for an optometry practice and then maybe just educate patients about their frames, or if you wish, you can truly offset the amount of carbon that you're responsible for. The results of that project are still being written up and I hope to give you an answer fairly soon. But in the meantime, just to put carbon footprint into a real life example, because the pattern of how we place orders influences the carbon that we are responsible for. So let's use a pair of Ray-Bans as an example, and we'll ignore the fact that some Ray-Bans are made in China because we're only going to look at shipping, and for most UK orders they come from Italy. So Italian Ray-Bans are made in the Luxottica factory in Agado, 60 miles north of Venice. To get a package from Agado to my practice in Durham, we've got around about 100 miles of road travel and 2,000 miles of air travel. In carbon terms, that's roughly 120 kilograms for the air travel and 15 kilograms for the road travel, about 135 kilograms, presuming that the package comes by the shortest route. Now, if I order one frame from the factory, it's the same carbon footprint as ordering 10. If I ordered 10, then the carbon footprint for the travel of that frame reduces to 13.5 kilograms. If we could limit individual orders, then our carbon footprint per frame reduces significantly. So we could specify that we wanted sea freight rather than air freight, but it would take a lot longer. We could wait to place the order until we had multiple orders from the same factory, or join orders from other practices in the same geographic area. Are any of these practical solutions? Not a chance. I can't really ever imagine a situation where a patient will agree to wait a few weeks before a frame is ordered to reduce the carbon footprint of that order. Patient expectation is just too high. Everyone wants to be sustainable, but only if it doesn't inconvenience us too much. And that brings with it another big question. Is being sustainable good for business? Well, again, I think it's a bit of a balance. From one perspective, it's something that patients are starting to ask more about. Customers are starting to become more aware of environmental issues and starting to seek out companies that will give them what they want. We've already mentioned that from the survey, 96% of patients said that they actively bought sustainable products. That being said, one of the other questions in the survey was, when choosing glasses, how important is sustainability? Is it the most important issue? Does it influence you? Or have you never thought about it? And 69% of patients said that they'd never thought about it before. Around 12% of patients said that sustainability was their main concern when buying frames, so that should give us a little confidence that there is some market there, and maybe we could start sourcing sustainable brands. But there are other things as an optometry businesses that we don't want, and we don't really want our patients to take the sustainable attitude to the extreme. For example, being sustainable means using less resources, recycle or reuse, but we don't really want our patients to constantly reuse their frames. It's a more sustainable choice, but if everyone started to reglaze their frames rather than buying new ones, then our businesses would start to suffer. And a lot of small ethical frame companies are bypassing opticians and selling direct to the public. Some of them refuse to sell to optometry practices because they see us as part of the problem. We're taking too much profit. So we don't really want to get patients interested in sustainability just for them to bypass us, look online and buy direct from the manufacturer. And even from a clinical standpoint, there are balances. I've got a patient that will not wear daily disposable contact lenses because she hates to think that she is throwing something away that's only been used once. She feels it's a single-use plastic. Last year she had a corneal ulcer that ate through a quarter of the thickness of a cornea. Personally, I would now prefer that she either didn't wear lenses or change to daily lenses or an IGP. But she won't do it. Now, this in itself is an hour's discussion, but I only use it as an example to show you that some patients can take ethical opinions to the extreme. And as you all know, you can't change every patient's opinion, even when you show them the evidence. I would say, though, for most people, I think it's the opposite. They like to be seen as buying something sustainable, but there is a point where their principles fall down if it inconveniences them too much. But probably the most persuasive slide for all you proper business people out there to start sourcing sustainable frames is this one. In the survey, 92% of patients said that they would pay more for a frame that was guaranteed to be sustainable. And 65% of optometry staff said that they would be willing to take less profit, which is great, but it probably isn't necessary if there are enough consumers that want that product. So there is a market for products that are guaranteed to be sustainable, but it's a complex and somewhat personal issue, and we need to know which of the issues that people care about. So remember, I asked people in my survey to pick their top 3 issues, and the results are kind of all over the place. And I guess the way to interpret that confusing slide quickly is that there are a range of issues that people care about. Although all of the optometry staff agree with me that the amount of plastic really isn't an issue in our industry, 13% of patients believe that it is. So we either need to re-educate them or provide a product that fits their worldview. As we've mentioned, this is a complex topic. The right answer for one person is not necessarily the right answer for another, and people tend to believe the information from sources that they come across and trust. So trying to put all this into some sort of practical guide, and I think one of the main ways that we can change our industry is by asking more questions of our suppliers and possibly challenging the answers that we get. And this is what I tried to do a few years ago with the ethical supply questionnaire that I developed. This was validated by a magazine called Ethical Consumer, who are used to grading companies on issues like this. And I sent them the questionnaire for validation just to make sure that I was asking the right questions. This questionnaire is not perfect and it does need a bit of rewriting, but it was my way to try and make an effort to be more sustainable. The idea is that for each question that the supplier was able to answer, they get a point, and then their total score gives me something that I can grade them with and then show those results to my customers. There's 9 questions. The first few questions were designed to try and see whether the company takes ethical issues seriously. But because I also use some quite small frame companies, I didn't want to mark them down too much if a really small ethical company didn't have the time and money to get an official certificate, and that's why I separated the two questions. So 1, can they demonstrate that ethical concerns are important to them? And 2, do they have an environmental quality management or health and safety management system in place? The question has come up as to whether we as optometry practices should register for ISO 9001. It's an internationally recognised quality management system, and companies that possess this registration hold a certain level of credibility. Personally, I think it's more relevant to our suppliers than to us, and maybe that is chickening out a little bit, but I know from my wife's work, my wife's an architect, that getting ISO 9001 is a very long and ongoing admin task, which also includes 3 on-site inspections every single year. And honestly, I can't quite face that level of admin and the admin involved in an NHS contract. ISO 9001 is more general. ISO 14001 is more relevant to what we're talking about, because for this registration you have to define how your company interacts with the environment. And ISO 45001 is an international standard for health and safety. If a factory possesses this registration, then it's a sign that they look after their workers. So the next 2 questions were about the traceability of the product, either the product or the raw materials. So can we trace the product back to the original manufacturer, and can we trace the materials back to the original producers? And as you might imagine, very few larger companies know where their raw materials come from. The next question is about workers' rights. Are the standards within the factory humane and ethical? And this is an important question, but we do have to be careful not to apply our own Western prejudices to a different society. In general, though, we want to make sure that workers are looked after and receive a fair wage for what they do. A great and honest answer for this came from Zeal, who make sunglasses from castor oil-based acetate. And they told me that they could guarantee that there was no child labour in their factories, but they also used farmers to grow their castor plants, and some of the farmers asked their sons to help in the fields during harvest. I thought that was a really honest answer. Questions 6 and 7 are about the materials used in the product. If it's plastic, is it plant-based or petroleum-based? If it's a metal frame, what are the alloys used? If it's titanium, is it mined from a reputable source? If it's wood, is it from an FSB-approved timber? Does the product contain any dyes, paints or other additives? And again, these are difficult questions for some companies because they are too far removed from the manufacturer. And then we're looking at packaging. As we've mentioned, it's a very important part of trying to make the product more sustainable. So does the supplier make an attempt to reduce the environmental impact of their packaging? And lastly, recycling. Is the product or the raw material of the product recyclable? So as I say, this questionnaire is not perfect and it does need a bit of rewriting, but it was my baby step at trying to make a change. I've given this to all of my suppliers and I've had answers back from about 50% of them. I haven't stopped using a company that won't answer the questions, but equally in the last few years I've only opened new accounts with companies that do answer the questions. It would be nice at some point to be completely sustainable and only use those companies that will complete the questionnaire, but I'm not perfect and I also have to be realistic. We have to remain competitive and a lot of cheap suppliers cannot or will not answer many of these questions. The great thing is though that people are trying. There are lots and lots of companies starting to pop up now offering sustainable eyewear as part of their core message. Here are a few, and I'm sure I will have missed somebody out somewhere. And also remember that these companies are just the ones where sustainability is at the very core of what they do. There's lots of other optical companies looking at ways of reducing their environmental footprint. For example, Wolf Eyewear was never set up to be an ethical brand, but they are now starting to use bioacetate and recycled material for most of their product. All of the companies on this slide are using bioacetate or recycled plastics and generally recycling their packaging also. They'll also tend to concentrate on a particular sustainable attribute that they tell us about when they come and see us. So for example, Coral Eyewear use recycled nylon product. They get their raw material from marine waste or landfill. February 31st use ethical timber, and they tell us that they don't keep a warehouse full of stock. Each frame is made to order, so they don't need to use the energy to heat warehouses. Neubau will tell us about their moulded frames that produce no plastic waste and a carbon neutral factory. Bird donate to a charity called Solar Aid that gives solar lamps to families in Africa in replace of fossil fuel lamps. Paula Eyewear give back to vision charities in Africa. Botanique use all recycled packaging and plant a tree to offset some of the carbon footprint of their product. Wildwood donate 1% of their turnover to environmental causes. Eco's metal frames are made from 95% recycled plastic, and they also plant a tree for every frame sold. And C2C use recycled marine waste, so are helping clear the oceans, each frame representing 10 metres squared of cleared ocean. These are all great attributes. We should be careful that we don't get hooked on the headlines, but this is all a welcome change in our industry. So, can we draw any conclusions? This is a complicated topic. Well, back to my survey again for the last time, and I asked, which of these issues do you believe is the greatest obstacle to a sustainable optometry industry? The options were a lack of information, a lack of suitable products, or people not understanding the issues. And both sets of people agreed that it's the lack of information, either from suppliers or from opticians, that was the biggest obstacle to a sustainable industry. So one conclusion is that we need more information about sustainability. And whose responsibility is that? Well, if you remember, 60% of optometry staff thought it was the manufacturer. They had the greater responsibility. So who do you think patients thought? We agree. 68% of patients thought that the manufacturer had the greater responsibility. So maybe we should be holding those manufacturers more to account and asking more questions to plug that gap of information, because we are that bridge between the manufacturer and the patient. You're welcome to use my sustainable questionnaire if you like, but you don't have to. You can make your own, but I can email a copy of mine if you would like. So back to that original question, sustainable optometry, can we really save the world? Probably not, but does that mean we shouldn't try? Hell no, and for 3 reasons. 1, we should be demanding transparency from our suppliers. We are endorsing their product, and we should expect a high standard for our practices. If no one asks them these questions about ethical trade and materials, then they won't know that people care about the issues, and they will be tempted to reduce standards. 2, whenever I talk to a patient about sustainable frames, they always tell me that it's something that they've never thought of before. From my survey, 69% of patients had never thought about it. So if we start to talk about sustainable issues in our industry, then as they go about their day-to-day lives, they'll start to think about issues in other industries, and it's that change of mindset that's going to make the biggest difference to our planet. And 3, we have a debt to pay. I hope you like some of my photos, my butterfly photos. All of them are my photos except one. One of them has an important reminder for optometry. I'd be impressed if anyone spotted it, so I'll show you it again. This is the hawksbill sea turtle. This is our tortoiseshell material that we've all got synthetic examples of on our frame racks. The shell has been used for generations, as far back as ancient Egypt, to make nice things for human use. And of course it wasn't just us in our industry, but if you look at any blog or article about the hawksbill turtle, then the fact that it was used for spectacle frames comes up. Our industry was a heavy user of tortoiseshell. And these are beautiful creatures. They're thought to live between 35 and 50 years. They were the first example that we found in nature of biofluorescence. Sea turtles have been on this planet for 120 million years, and us humans have only been sharing it with them for 0.3 million of those years. And they're now listed as critically endangered by the IUCN Red List. Their population has declined over 80% in the last 100 years, primarily because their shell is nice to look at and to make things with. They were hunted to the brink of extinction until trade of its shell was finally made illegal in 1992. So if our small, inconsequential industry has enough influence to help bring a creature like this to the brink of extinction, it can positively use whatever influence that it has to start bringing a change to the world. Sustainable optometry deserves to be at the core of what we do. Thanks for listening.